What would you do if everyone in the room treated you like furniture, until one glimpse of ink on your skin made 4-star generals snap to attention? This is the story of Elena Vasquez and how 30 seconds changed everything in the most secure room in the Pentagon. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning fog hung thick over the Potomac as Elena Vasquez pulled her weathered Toyota Camry into the Pentagon's civilian employee parking garage. At 38, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Average height, dark hair pulled into a practical bun, wearing a navy blue blazer that had seen better days over a simple white blouse. Her employee badge hung from a retractable cord, identifying her as what she'd been for the past 6 years, GS-7 Administrative Specialist, Defense Intelligence Operations Center. Elena gathered her worn leather messenger bag and the stack of classified folders that would consume her day. Inside those folders were intelligence reports, operational summaries, and logistics data that needed to be digitized, cross-referenced, and filed according to protocols so complex they required a security clearance just to understand. It was tedious work, the kind that made people's eyes glaze over when she tried to explain what she did for a living at neighborhood barbecues. She moved through the Pentagon's maze-like corridors with the efficient stride of someone who knew every shortcut, every checkpoint, every security protocol by heart. 6 years of the same routine had worn smooth grooves in her daily path. Badge scan at Checkpoint Alpha, nod to Security Officer Martinez, who always had coffee breath and asked about her weekend plans. Elevator to the 3rd floor, another badge scan. Another checkpoint. Another polite but dismissive glance from whoever happened to be manning the desk. The Defense Intelligence Operations Center occupied an entire wing of the Pentagon, but Elena's world was much smaller. Cubicle 3B47, positioned in what the analysts called the farm, rows upon rows of administrative staff who processed the paperwork that kept America's intelligence apparatus functioning. She shared her corner of the farm with Janet Kowalski, a chatty grandmother from Arlington who handled personnel files, and David Chun, a recent college graduate who spent most of his time updating databases and complaining about student loans. Elena's cubicle was sparse, functional. A desktop computer that had been cutting edge during the Obama administration. A small digital photo of her late mother. A coffee mug from the 2018 Pentagon charity drive that she'd forgotten to take home and had somehow become permanent. No personal items that might invite questions about her past. No military memorabilia that might hint at experiences beyond filing reports and attending mandatory training sessions. The morning started like every other. Elena logged into her secure terminal and began working through the overnight intelligence summaries. Reports from field operations, tactical assessments, personnel updates, the endless stream of information that flowed through the Pentagon's nervous system. Her job was to read, categorize, digitize, and route. She was a human sorting machine. And she was very good at it. Around 10 o'clock, her supervisor, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, appeared at her cubicle with a clipboard and an expression of barely contained irritation. Mrs. Hendricks was 55, had worked in government administration for 30 years, and treated her position as Senior Administrative Coordinator like it was a cabinet appointment. She wore her authority like armor, always reminding people that she had access to general schedules and classified briefing materials. "Vasquez, I need you to handle a special assignment today," Mrs. Hendricks announced without preamble. Operations. Planning is requesting immediate digitization of historical field reports for the Syrian Operations Archive. They need them inputted into the new database system by end of business. Elena looked up from her computer screen. How many reports are we talking about? Approximately 430 documents, ranging from 2 to 20 pages each. All classified secret or above. Mrs. Hendricks consulted her clipboard. "They're currently stored in hard copy in the operations planning vault," Elena calculated quickly. Even working efficiently, that volume of documents would take days to process properly. When do they need this completed? Today, the archive. Review board meets tomorrow morning, and they need digital access for their assessment. Mrs. Hendricks' tone suggested that questioning the timeline was inappropriate. "The documents are in Conference Room C in the Operations Planning Wing. You'll need to work there. The materials can't leave the secure area." Conference Room C was in the heart of the Operations Planning Wing, several floors above Elena's usual domain and considerably closer to the Pentagon centers of power. It was where field commanders briefed senior staff, where tactical decisions were made, where people with stars on their collars decided matters of national security. Elena had never worked in that area before. Her security clearance gave her access, but she'd never had reason to venture beyond the administrative corridors. "Will I be working alone?" Elena asked. "Yes, the room has been reserved for this project. Just set up your laptop and get started. Badge access has been updated to include the secure areas you'll need." Mrs. Hendricks turned to leave, then paused. "And Vasquez, try to be invisible up there. That area is for senior personnel. Don't wander around, don't ask questions, and don't draw attention to yourself." An hour later, Elena stood outside Conference Room C, balancing her laptop bag and a stack of access forms. The Operations Planning Wing felt different from her usual workspace. The corridors were wider, the lighting brighter. The walls were lined with photographs of military operations, maps of global deployments, and portraits of distinguished service members. Everything seemed designed to remind visitors that this was where serious people made serious decisions. She badged into Conference Room C and found herself in a space that was clearly designed for important meetings. A large oval table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Multiple large-screen monitors lined the walls, currently dark but obviously capable of displaying real-time intelligence feeds. The room smelled faintly of coffee and leather, with an underlying hint of the industrial carpet cleaner used throughout. The Pentagon. Along one wall, she found her assignment: 4 large boxes of files, each stamped with security classifications and handling restrictions. Elena set up her laptop at one end of the conference table and began the methodical process of sorting through decades of field reports from operations in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen other locations she recognized from news reports, but had never seen firsthand. The documents painted a picture of a complex, dangerous world that existed far beyond the bureaucratic safety of the Pentagon. Field reports from forward operating bases, intelligence assessments from embedded operatives, after-action reports from missions that had succeeded or failed in ways that would never make the evening news. Elena processed each document with professional efficiency, but she couldn't help noticing the details that brought these operations to life. The careful handwriting of field commanders working by lamplight, radio intercepts transcribed under hostile fire, maps marked with positions and movements that represented real people in real danger. By lunchtime, she had made significant progress through the first box. The work was familiar. She had processed similar documents countless times, but the setting made everything feel different. Through the conference room's windows, she could see the Pentagon's inner courtyard and the constant flow of uniformed personnel moving between meetings, briefings, and the countless other activities that kept the world's most powerful military functioning. Around 2 o'clock, Elena became aware of voices in the corridor outside. Not unusual in itself, the Operations Planning Wing was a busy place, but these voices carried the kind of authority that made people pay attention. She glanced up from her laptop as the door opened and 3 men in military uniform entered the room, deep in conversation about deployment schedules and logistics coordination. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed Elena sitting at the conference table, Surrounded by classified documents, and obviously not where they expected her to be, the three officers stood frozen in the doorway, clearly not expecting to find anyone in what they had assumed would be an empty conference room. Elena looked up from her laptop, took in their uniforms and bearing, and immediately recognized the kind of authority that came with years of command experience and enough stars to influence policy at the highest levels. The man in the center was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His uniform bore the insignia of a full colonel, with enough ribbons and decorations to indicate extensive combat experience. To his left stood a younger major, probably in his early 40s, with the lean build and alert eyes of special operations. Background: the third man was a Navy captain whose weathered face suggested years at sea before transitioning to Pentagon assignments. "Excuse me," the colonel said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that made it clear this was not actually a request. "I think there's been some confusion. This room is reserved for a classified briefing." Elena saved her work and looked up from the laptop screen. "I'm sorry for the interruption, sir. I'm Elena Vasquez from Administrative Services. I was assigned to work in here today on a digitization project for the Syrian Operations Archive. My supervisor said the room was reserved for this purpose." The colonel exchanged glances with his companions. "Administrative Services? Who authorized you to work with those documents?" "Mrs. Hendricks, my supervisor. The Operations Planning Division requested immediate digitization for the Archive Review Board meeting tomorrow." Elena gestured to the boxes of files around her. "I have the work order if you need to see it." The major stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Ma'am, these are highly classified operational records. Are you certain you have the appropriate clearance level for this material?" Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had encountered this reaction before, the assumption that someone in her position couldn't possibly be trusted with genuinely important work. "Yes, sir. I have secret clearance with C access. I've been processing similar documents for 6 years." The Navy captain was studying the files Elena had been working with, his expression growing more concerned. "Colonel Morrison, some of these reports are from operations I was involved in personally. I'm not comfortable with them being handled by ... double quotes," he paused, clearly searching for diplomatically appropriate phrasing, "by personnel who might not fully understand the operational context." Colonel Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your dedication, Miss Vasquez, but I think there may have been a miscommunication about the sensitivity of this material. Perhaps you could return to your regular duties while we sort this out with your supervisor." Elena felt her jaw tighten slightly. She had been working with classified material for years, had undergone extensive background investigations, and had never had a security incident or breach of any kind. But she recognized the tone in Colonel Morrison's voice. It was the same tone she had heard countless times over the past 6 years, the gentle but firm dismissal that came from people who saw her badge and her cubicle assignment and made immediate assumptions about her capabilities and trustworthiness. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but I have explicit authorization to be here. Mrs. Hendricks can verify that this project was requested by Operations Planning specifically." Elena kept her voice level and professional. "I'm experienced with this type of work, and the timeline is quite tight. The Archive Review Board needs these documents digitized by tomorrow morning." The major pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be his calendar. "Colonel, we're supposed to have this room for the logistics coordination briefing in 20 minutes. Admiral Chun and General Rodriguez are expecting to review the Middle East deployment scenarios." Colonel Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Vasquez, I'm going to need you to pack up your materials and find somewhere else to work. This room is needed for senior staff meetings, and frankly, the presence of unauthorized personnel during sensitive briefings is a security concern." Unauthorized? Elena stood up slowly, feeling the familiar anger building in her chest. Sir, I'm not unauthorized. I have proper clearance, explicit work orders, and badge access that was specifically updated for this assignment. The Navy captain was now examining Elena's laptop screen, where part of a tactical assessment was visible. These reports contain operational details about missions that are still classified at levels above secret. Even if you have general secret clearance, that doesn't necessarily mean you have need to know for specific operations. Elena realized that what had started as a simple misunderstanding was escalating into something more problematic. The three officers were clearly convinced that she didn't belong in this room, working with these documents, and they were beginning to treat her presence as a potential security violation rather than an administrative assignment. Gentlemen, I think you should contact Mrs. Hendricks in Administrative Services to verify this assignment, Elena said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'm sure we can resolve this confusion quickly. Colonel Morrison was already reaching for the secure phone mounted on the conference room wall. I think that's exactly what we need to do. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the documents until we can verify your authorization. Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had seen this dynamic before, had lived through variations of this exact situation more times than she cared to remember. People in positions of authority making assumptions based on limited information, then doubling down on those assumptions when challenged. The fact that she was right, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be doing, exactly what she was authorized to do, would become irrelevant once they decided she was a problem to be solved. Sir, I understand your position, but I need to continue working. This project has a firm deadline, and I've already invested several hours in organizing and processing these documents. Elena gestured to the neat stacks of files she had created. I'm happy to coordinate with your meeting schedule, but I can't simply abandon an assignment because of scheduling conflicts. The Major's expression had shifted from skeptical to openly suspicious. Ma'am, your insistence on remaining here, despite our concerns, is itself concerning. Most administrative personnel would be eager to avoid potential complications with senior staff. The implication was clear, and Elena felt her professional composure beginning to crack. They weren't just questioning her authorization anymore. They were questioning her motives. In their minds, she had transformed from a misplaced clerk into a potential security risk who was suspiciously determined to remain in a room full of classified information. Colonel Morrison finished his phone call and turned back to the group. I've left a message for Mrs. Hendricks, but she's apparently in meetings for the rest of the afternoon. Until we can verify this assignment, I'm going to have to insist that you gather your materials and relocate. Elena looked at the boxes of documents around her, calculated the hours of work she would lose if forced to pack everything up and start over elsewhere, and made a decision that would change everything. No, sir, I'm not moving. The room fell completely silent. Outside in the corridor, Elena could hear the sound of footsteps and muffled conversations. But inside Conference Room C, 3 senior military officers stared at a civilian administrative clerk who had just refused a direct order from a full colonel. Elena could see the moment when their confusion turned to anger, when a minor scheduling conflict became something much more serious. The lines had been drawn, and there was no going back. Colonel Morrison's face darkened to a shade that suggested Elena had just crossed a line that most people knew better than to approach. The Major took a step closer, his hand instinctively moving toward the radio clipped to his belt. The Navy captain was already pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen in what Elena recognized as the beginning of an escalation protocol. Miss Vasquez, Colonel Morrison's voice had dropped to the kind of controlled tone that experienced military personnel used when they were containing their anger through sheer force of will. I don't think you understand the gravity of what you just said. This is a military installation, and when senior officers give you direction, period, Elena remained standing beside her laptop, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had been in situations like this before, though never quite in this context. "Sir, with respect, you're not my commanding officer. I'm a civilian employee with specific work assignments, and I have just as much right to be in this room as anyone else with proper authorization." The major finished his radio call and turned back to the group. "Security is en route." "Colonel, do you want me to contact General Harrison's office? If we're dealing with a potential security incident involving classified materials, he's going to want to know about it immediately." Elena felt her stomach drop. General Harrison was the deputy director of operations planning, a three-star general whose name appeared on high-level briefings and policy documents. Having her administrative dispute escalated to a general's attention was exactly the kind of visibility that could destroy her career and potentially her security clearance. But backing down now would mean abandoning not just her work assignment, but her right to be treated with basic professional respect. "That won't be necessary," Elena said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "This is a simple administrative matter that can be resolved with one phone call to my supervisor. There's no need to involve General Harrison in a scheduling confusion." Colonel Morrison's laugh was devoid of any humor. "Miss Vasquez, this stopped being a scheduling confusion the moment you refused a direct order to vacate this room. You've now made this a matter of facility security and chain of command compliance." The conference room door opened and two Pentagon security officers entered, their presence immediately changing the dynamic in the room. Both were military police with the kind of bearing that suggested they had dealt with much more serious situations than administrative disputes. The senior officer, a staff sergeant with graying temples and alert eyes, approached Colonel Morrison with professional deference. "Sir, we received a report of a potential security incident involving unauthorized access to classified materials. How can we assist?" Colonel Morrison gestured toward Elena. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this civilian employee is refusing to comply with instructions to remove herself from a secure briefing area. She's currently in possession of highly classified operational documents, and we've been unable to verify her authorization to access this material." Elena watched as Sergeant Rodriguez's expression shifted from routine inquiry to focused attention. She could see him taking in the scene, boxes of classified files, her laptop displaying sensitive information, three senior officers clearly agitated by her presence. In his experience, situations like this usually had obvious solutions. "Ma'am." Sergeant Rodriguez addressed Elena with professional courtesy that carried an underlying firmness. "I'm going to need to see your identification and security credentials. Can you also provide documentation of your work authorization for these materials?" Elena reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her Pentagon ID badge, then accessed her laptop to display the work order Mrs. Hendricks had provided. "Sergeant, I'm Elena Vasquez, GS7 Administrative Specialist. I was assigned to digitize these Syrian Operations Archive documents for the Archive Review Board meeting tomorrow. My clearance level is secret with SCI access, and my badge access was specifically updated this morning to include this secure area." Sergeant Rodriguez examined her credentials carefully, then studied the work order on her laptop screen. Elena could see him processing the information, trying to reconcile what appeared to be legitimate authorization with the obvious concerns of three senior officers. "Ma'am, your credentials appear to be in order," Sergeant Rodriguez said slowly. "However, these gentlemen have raised concerns about the appropriateness of your access to these specific documents. Until we can verify the details of your assignment with your supervisory chain, I think it would be appropriate for you to secure your materials and relocate to a non-sensitive area." Elena felt the walls closing in around her. Even when presented with proof of her authorization, the default assumption was that the senior officers must be right and she must be wrong. The institutional bias was so automatic that even security personnel trained to evaluate evidence objectively were deferring to rank rather than facts. "Sergeant, I understand the concern, but relocating these materials would violate security protocols. They're classified secret and above, which means they can't be removed from this designated secure area. If I pack them up and move somewhere else, I'd be creating the exact kind of security violation everyone is supposedly trying to prevent." The second security officer, a younger corporal, had been examining the file boxes and now looked up with obvious concern. "Sergeant Rodriguez, she's right about the handling restrictions. These documents are marked for secure area access only. Moving them to a general work area would be a protocol violation." Colonel Morrison's patience was clearly exhausted. "Then we'll secure the documents and suspend the project until proper authorization can be verified. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want those files locked down and this area cleared immediately." Elena realized that she was watching her work assignment being dismantled in real time. Hours of careful organization would be lost, the tight deadline would be missed, and worst of all, she would be branded as someone who couldn't handle sensitive assignments without creating security incidents. The unfairness of it hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, you're punishing me for following my authorized assignment because it's inconvenient for your meeting schedule," Elena said, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. "I've done nothing wrong, violated no protocols, and followed every security procedure exactly as required. The only problem here is that you didn't expect to find me in this room." The major stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Ma'am, you need to check your attitude. Regardless of your work assignment, you're speaking to senior military officers who have legitimate concerns about security protocols. Your combative response is inappropriate and concerning." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. She had heard variations of this speech before, in different contexts and different uniforms, but always with the same underlying message: know your place. Accept your position. Don't challenge authority even when authority is wrong. The fact that she was right became irrelevant once they decided she was the problem. "I'm not being combative," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I'm trying to complete an assignment I was given by my supervisor, using authorization I was properly granted in a room I have legitimate access to. If that seems combative to you, perhaps the problem isn't with my attitude." The room fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of Pentagon operations continuing beyond the conference room door. Elena could see the moment when Colonel Morrison's annoyance transformed into something more serious. She had just challenged not only his specific instructions, but the entire assumption that his rank gave him the right to override her legitimate work assignment. "Sergeant." Rodriguez was speaking quietly into his radio, and Elena caught fragments of phrases that made her stomach clench. "Elevated security concern. Non-cooperative civilian personnel. Request supervisory response." The machinery of institutional authority was grinding into motion, and she was about to be crushed beneath it. Within minutes, the conference room had transformed from a quiet workspace into what felt like a crisis management center. 2 additional officers had arrived in response to Sergeant Rodriguez's radio call: Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes from Internal Security and Major David Kim from Operations Planning. Both carried themselves with the brisk efficiency of people accustomed to handling problems that threatened to spiral out of control. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair pulled into a regulation bun and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had spent her career navigating male-dominated environments through sheer competence and unwillingness to back down. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency, taking in the classified documents, Elena's laptop setup, and the obvious tension radiating from everyone present. "Gentlemen, I understand we have a situation involving unauthorized access to classified materials," Hayes said. her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with far more serious security breaches than administrative disputes. "Can someone provide me with a concise summary of the circumstances?" Colonel Morrison stepped forward, clearly relieved to have someone of equivalent rank to handle what he obviously considered an increasingly troublesome situation. "Colonel Hayes, we discovered this civilian employee working unsupervised with highly classified operational records. When we questioned her authorization and requested that she relocate to accommodate a scheduled senior staff briefing, she became combative and refused to comply with our instructions." Elena felt her face flush with anger at the characterization. "That's not what happened, ma'am. I was assigned to work in this room by my supervisor to digitize documents for the Archive Review Board meeting tomorrow. When these officers arrived for an unscheduled meeting, I explained my assignment and offered to coordinate with their schedule. I only refused to leave when Colonel Morrison demanded that I abandon my authorized work without any verification of his authority to override my assignment." Major Kim had been examining Elena's laptop screen and the work orders she had displayed. "Ma'am, according to these documents, this project was requested by Operations Planning, but I can't find any record of our division making such a request. Our standard protocol for archive digitization involves contracted personnel with specialized security clearances, not general administrative staff." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Major, the work order came directly from Mrs. Hendricks in Administrative Services. She said Operations Planning had requested immediate digitization for the Archive Review Board meeting." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes picked up one of the files Elena had been processing and examined the classification markings. "Miss Vasquez, these are operational after-action reports from active combat zones. Some of these documents contain information about ongoing intelligence operations and personnel deployments. Are you certain you have the appropriate clearance level and need to know authorization for this specific material?" Elena pulled up her security clearance documentation on her laptop. "Yes, ma'am. I have secret clearance with C-Access. I've been processing similar documents for 6 years without any security incidents or protocol violations. My supervisor assured me that this assignment was within my authorization parameters." Colonel Morrison was examining one of the files Elena had already processed. "Colonel Hayes, look at this. This particular report details a classified operation I was personally involved in during my deployment to Syria. The operational details in this document are so sensitive that even some of the personnel who participated in the mission don't have access to the complete after-action assessment." Elena realized with growing alarm that the discussion was shifting from her authorization to process documents to questions about her right to access specific operational details. "Sir, I'm not reading these documents for content. I'm digitizing them for archive purposes. My job is to scan them into the database system, not to analyze or interpret the information." Major Kim looked up from his phone with an expression of concern. "Colonel Hayes, I just checked with our archive management office. They have no record of any urgent digitization request, and there's no Archive Review Board meeting scheduled for tomorrow." Whatever Mrs. Hendricks was told, it didn't come from our division. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over everyone present. Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized that her entire assignment might be based on miscommunication or misinformation. But even worse was the growing suspicion she could see in the eyes of the officers around her. "Miss Vasquez," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "can you think of any reason why you might have been given inaccurate information about this assignment? Is it possible that someone wanted you to have access to these specific documents for reasons unrelated to archive management?" Elena stared at Hayes in disbelief. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that I somehow arranged to be given access to classified documents under false pretenses? I received this assignment from my supervisor this morning. I have no control over the requests that come to our division or the work orders that get generated. Sergeant Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation with increasing concern. "Ma'am, if there's any question about the legitimacy of this assignment, I recommend we secure all materials immediately and initiate a formal security review. Until we can verify the circumstances that led to this situation, we should treat this as a potential security incident." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. What had started as a scheduling conflict was now being treated as a potential security breach, with her as the primary suspect. The fact that she had done nothing wrong was becoming irrelevant in the face of institutional suspicion and automatic assumptions about her motives. "Colonel Hayes, I've worked in this building for 6 years without a single security incident," Elena said, trying to keep her voice level despite the panic building in her chest. "I have no reason to seek unauthorized access to classified information. And I certainly wouldn't do it in such an obvious way if that was my intention." Major Kim was now scrolling through what appeared to be personnel records on his secure tablet. "Ma'am, according to our database, Miss Vasquez has standard administrative clearance for routine classified materials, but some of these documents are classified well above her normal access level. Even if her assignment was legitimate, there may have been an error in the scope of materials she was given access to." Elena realized that even if she could prove her assignment was legitimate, she was still going to be blamed for processing documents that someone had decided were above her clearance level. The system was designed to protect itself by finding fault with the lowest-ranking person available, regardless of the actual facts of the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was now examining Elena's security credentials more carefully. "Miss Vasquez, I noticed that your current clearance was last updated 3 years ago. Have you had any changes in your personal circumstances, financial situation, or foreign contacts that might affect your security status?" The question hit Elena like a slap. Hayes was following standard security review protocols, but the implication was clear. They were now investigating her as a potential security risk rather than trying to resolve a simple administrative confusion. Every aspect of her life was now subject to scrutiny and suspicion. "No, ma'am. No changes in my personal circumstances that would affect my security clearance. I undergo periodic reinvestigation just like every other cleared employee, and I've never had any issues identified during those reviews." Colonel Morrison was gathering the files Elena had been working with, clearly preparing to remove them from her access. "Colonel Hayes, regardless of how this situation developed, I think we need to suspend this project immediately until we can conduct a thorough review. The sensitivity of these materials requires that we err on the side of caution." Elena watched as hours of careful work were dismantled before her eyes. More importantly, she was watching her professional reputation being destroyed by people who had decided she was guilty of something without bothering to determine what that something might be. The unfairness of it was overwhelming, but she also recognized the futility of arguing with an institutional mindset that had already reached its conclusions. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but I hope you'll verify my assignment with Mrs. Hendricks before making any permanent decisions about my security status. I came to work this morning expecting to complete a routine administrative task, not to find myself under investigation for doing exactly what I was told to do, Lieutenant Colonel." Hayes closed Elena's laptop and began gathering her work materials. "Miss Vasquez, until we can sort this out, I'm going to have to ask you to report to the security office for a formal interview. This situation has raised enough questions that we need to document everything thoroughly." Elena realized that she was now facing the prospect of a formal security investigation that could result in the loss of her clearance, her job, and her ability to work anywhere in the defense industry. All because she had tried to complete an assignment and had refused to be pushed around by people who assumed she didn't belong where she had every right to be. The institutional machinery of suspicion was grinding into motion, and Elena was directly in its path. The security office was located in the basement level of the Pentagon, in a section that most employees never saw and hoped never to visit. Elena walked between Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Jackson, acutely aware that her escort through the building's corridors was drawing curious stares from colleagues and strangers alike. Word traveled fast in the Pentagon, and by the time they reached the elevator, she could already hear whispered conversations following in their wake. "Isn't that the clerk from Administrative Services?" she heard someone murmur as they passed a group of junior officers near the cafeteria entrance. "I heard she was caught with classified documents she wasn't supposed to have." Elena kept her eyes forward, fighting the urge to turn around and correct the growing mythology that was already transforming her administrative dispute into something far more sinister. She could feel her professional reputation crumbling in real time, spread through the Pentagon's informal communication network that was faster and more efficient than any official announcement system. The security office occupied a series of windowless rooms designed to be as intimidating as possible. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested comfort was not a priority. Elena was directed to Interview Room B, where she found herself facing Captain Sarah Mitchell from Internal Security and Chief Warrant Officer James Torres from Criminal Investigation Command. Captain Mitchell was younger than Elena had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she had earned her position through competence rather than connections. Chief Torres was older, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years investigating everything from minor security violations to major espionage cases. Both studied Elena with the professional detachment of investigators who had learned not to make assumptions about guilt or innocence. "Miss Vasquez, thank you for your cooperation," Captain Mitchell began, consulting a thick folder that had apparently been assembled in the short time since Elena's detention. "We understand this situation may seem confusing to you, but we need to thoroughly document the circumstances that led to your presence in conference Room C with highly classified materials." Elena settled into the uncomfortable metal chair across from the investigators. "Captain, I'm happy to cooperate, but I hope you understand that I've done nothing wrong. I was completing an assignment given to me by my supervisor, using access permissions that were properly authorized through normal channels." Chief Torres leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, we've conducted preliminary interviews with the officers who discovered you in the conference room. Their account suggests that you were not only resistant to their concerns, but became increasingly argumentative when they questioned your authorization." Elena felt her jaw tighten. "Chief, I was polite and professional throughout that encounter. I explained my assignment, provided documentation, and offered to coordinate with their meeting schedule. I only became firm when they demanded that I abandon my authorized work without any justification for their authority to override my assignment." Captain Mitchell was reviewing what appeared to be Elena's personnel file. "Miss Vasquez, according to your employment history, you've been working in administrative positions for 6 years without any security incidents. Can you help us understand why this particular assignment might have created such an unusual situation?" Elena realized that even her investigators were operating from the assumption that she must have done something to create this problem. The institutional bias was so automatic that even trained investigators were looking for her mistakes rather than examining whether the officers who had challenged her might have acted inappropriately. "Captain, the only unusual aspect of this assignment was the location. I was told to work in Conference Room C because the classified materials couldn't be removed from the secure area. When senior officers arrived for an unscheduled meeting, they made assumptions about my presence based on my appearance and position rather than checking my authorization." Chief Torres consulted his notes. "Ma'am, Colonel Morrison indicates that your demeanor throughout the encounter was suspicious, and that your insistence on remaining in the room, despite their concerns, suggested inappropriate motivations for accessing classified materials." Elena stared at Torres in disbelief. "Chief, my motivation for remaining in the room was to complete the work assignment I was given. Colonel Morrison never presented any evidence that he had authority to override my supervisor's instructions or that my presence violated any security protocols. The interview room door opened and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes entered, carrying additional files and wearing an expression that suggested the situation had become more complicated rather than less. She took a seat at the table and spread several documents in front of the investigators. Captain Mitchell, Chief Torres, I've completed preliminary interviews with the personnel involved in this incident, and we have some concerning discrepancies that need to be addressed, Hayes announced. First, operations planning confirms that they made no request for archive digitization. Second, Mrs. Hendricks, Miss Vasquez's supervisor, is currently in a day-long budget meeting and hasn't been available to verify the circumstances of this assignment. Elena felt her stomach drop. Without Mrs. Hendricks available to confirm her assignment, she had no way to prove that she had been acting on legitimate orders rather than seeking unauthorized access to classified materials. Captain Mitchell looked up from the new files. "Ma'am, what's your assessment of the security implications?" The documents Miss Vasquez was processing include operational details from missions involving personnel who are still deployed in sensitive locations. Even inadvertent disclosure of some of this information could compromise ongoing operations and endanger American personnel. Hayes fixed Elena with a direct stare. "Miss Vasquez, given the sensitivity of this material, we need to understand exactly how you came to be assigned this particular work." Elena realized that the investigators were no longer trying to resolve a misunderstanding. They were building a case that assumed her guilt and required her to prove her innocence. "Ma'am, I received this assignment through normal channels from my immediate supervisor. I had no input into what documents were included or what specific information they contained. My job was to digitize them for archive purposes, not to read or analyze their contents." Chief Torres was now studying what appeared to be security footage timestamps. "Ma'am, according to our review, you accessed conference room C at 11:47 this morning and worked unsupervised with classified materials for over 2 hours before being discovered. During that time, you had unrestricted access to operational details that could be of significant value to foreign intelligence services." The implication was clear, and Elena felt a cold anger building in her chest. "Chief, are you suggesting that I was copying or transmitting classified information? Because if you are, I demand that you examine my laptop, check my network access logs, and review any security footage you have. You'll find that I did nothing except the digitization work I was assigned to perform." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes opened another file. "Miss Vasquez, we've reviewed your background investigation from your last periodic reinvestigation. The report notes that you have no military service, no family members in the military, and no previous experience with operational classified materials. Can you explain how someone with your background came to be trusted with such sensitive assignments?" Elena realized that her lack of military experience was now being used as evidence of her unsuitability for her job, despite 6 years of exemplary performance. The investigators were constructing a narrative in which her civilian background made her inherently suspicious rather than simply different from the military personnel who dominated the Pentagon. "Ma'am, I was hired specifically because my background investigation showed that I was trustworthy and reliable. My civilian status has never been considered a liability before today. I've processed thousands of classified documents over 6 years without a single security incident or protocol violation." Captain Mitchell consulted her timeline notes. "Miss Vasquez, several witnesses report that your behavior during the encounter with senior officers was confrontational, and that you seemed unusually determined to maintain access to the classified materials. How do you explain this characterization?" Elena felt her professional composure beginning to crack under the relentless assumption that she must be guilty of something. "Captain, I was determined to complete my assigned work, just like any dedicated employee would be. If that seems suspicious to you, then perhaps the problem is with how this organization treats its civilian employees, rather than with my performance." The room fell silent. Elena realized that she had just challenged not only the specific accusations against her, but the entire institutional culture that automatically assumed military personnel were more trustworthy than civilians. She could see the moment when her reasonable defense transformed into evidence of attitude problems and inappropriate responses to authority. "Chief." Torres closed his notebook with finality. "Ma'am, given the serious nature of these security concerns and your inability to provide independent verification of your assignment, we're going to have to suspend your security clearance pending a full investigation." Elena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Without her security clearance, she couldn't perform her job, couldn't work anywhere in the defense industry, and would be branded as a security risk for the rest of her career. All because she had tried to complete an assignment and had refused. To be bullied by officers who assumed she didn't belong where she had every right to be. Elena stared at Chief Torres as the weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Suspension of security clearance meant immediate removal from her position, a formal investigation that could take months or years to resolve, and the effective end of any career in government service, even if she was eventually cleared of wrongdoing. The stigma of a security investigation would follow her for the rest of her professional life. "Chief, you're destroying my career based on speculation and assumptions," Elena said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "I've provided you with documentation of my assignment, explained my actions throughout the day, and offered full cooperation with your investigation. What more do you want from me?" Captain Mitchell was already preparing the paperwork for Elena's clearance suspension. "Miss Vasquez, this is a precautionary measure designed to protect national security while we conduct a thorough investigation. If you've done nothing wrong, the investigation will clear you and your clearance will be restored." Elena almost laughed at the naivety of that statement. "Captain, you and I both know that security investigations follow their own logic. Once I'm labeled as a potential risk, every aspect of my life will be scrutinized for evidence that supports that conclusion. The fact that I've worked here for 6 years without incident will be overshadowed by the fact that senior officers found my behavior suspicious." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was reviewing what appeared to be the formal suspension documentation. "Miss Vasquez, I understand your frustration, but we have to follow protocols when security concerns are raised. The sensitivity of the materials you had access to requires that we err on the side of caution." Elena felt something cold and familiar settling in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced in other situations where institutional power was being used to crush individual integrity, where people in authority positions convinced themselves that destroying someone's life was justified by abstract security concerns. She had sworn years ago that she would never again allow herself to be victimized by people who confused their position with righteousness. "Colonel Hayes, before you sign those papers, I think you should know something about my background that didn't come up during your review of my personnel file," Elena said quietly. "Information that might change your assessment of whether I'm a security risk or a security asset." Chief Torres looked up from his paperwork with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, we've conducted a thorough review of your background investigation. Unless you're about to confess to activities that weren't disclosed during your clearance process, I don't think there's anything that would change our security assessment." Elena slowly stood up from her chair and began rolling up the sleeve of her navy blue blazer. "Chief, the problem with background investigations is that they only capture information that investigators know to look for. Sometimes the most important facts are the ones that don't appear in any official records." Captain Mitchell watched Elena's movements with growing curiosity. "Miss Vasquez, what are you trying to show us?" Elena pushed her sleeve up past her elbow, revealing her forearm for the first time since entering the Pentagon that morning. The tattoo was small but incredibly detailed, A series of interlocking gears surrounding the number 18, rendered in precise military script. Below the number, in even smaller text, were the letters BOTA and a date, March 15th, 2009. The room fell. Completely silent. Chief Torres stared at Elena's arm with an expression of growing confusion, clearly recognizing that the tattoo was military in nature, but not understanding its significance. Captain Mitchell leaned forward to get a better look, her investigator's instincts telling her that something important had just been revealed. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, however, had gone completely pale. She was staring at Elena's tattoo with the kind of recognition that comes from personal familiarity with military unit designations and operational codes. Her hands, which had been reaching for the clearance suspension paperwork, frozen mid-air. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Ma'am, Chief Torres said slowly, can you explain the significance of that tattoo? Elena looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who was still staring at her forearm with dawning comprehension. Chief, that tattoo represents my service with Operational Detachment Alpha 18. Special Forces during my deployment to Afghanistan from 2008 to 2010. The date commemorates a particular mission that I'm not authorized to discuss in detail, but which resulted in several unit citations and the successful completion of objectives that had strategic importance for ongoing operations. Captain Mitchell was now studying Elena with completely different eyes. Miss Vasquez, are you telling U.S. that you're a military veteran? Because your personnel file clearly indicates no prior military service. Elena carefully rolled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo that had remained hidden for over a decade. Captain, my military service was conducted under a classified program that doesn't appear in standard personnel records. After my discharge, I was advised to maintain operational security by not disclosing my service unless absolutely necessary for security or employment purposes. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes finally found her voice. Miss Vasquez, Operational Detachment Alpha 18 was a special operations unit that conducted classified missions in Afghanistan. If you're claiming service with that unit, you're talking about some of the most sensitive operations conducted during that time period. Elena nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I'm fully aware of the classification levels associated with ODA-18 operations. I'm also aware that my service record is restricted access and would not have appeared during standard background investigations for civilian employment. Chief Torres was now looking at Elena with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. Ma'am, can you provide verification of this military service? Because if what you're saying is true, it significantly changes our assessment of your background and your authorization to access classified materials. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled to a secure application that she hadn't accessed in years. Chief, I can provide you with a contact number for Colonel Patricia Reyes at Special Operations Command. She maintains the restricted personnel records for classified special operations veterans. She can verify my service and my current security status. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was studying Elena with entirely new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Miss Vasquez, why didn't you disclose this information when we began questioning your background and qualifications? Elena felt a bitter smile cross her face. Ma'am, because I learned a long time ago that my military service tends to create more problems than it solves. Most people have assumptions about female special operations veterans that are just as limiting as their assumptions about civilian clerks. I've found it easier to let my work speak for itself rather than dealing with people's preconceptions about who I used to be. Captain Mitchell was now reviewing Elena's actions throughout the day with completely different context. Miss Vasquez, if you have special operations background, that would explain your familiarity with classified operational materials and your comfort level with high security environments. Elena nodded. Captain, It would also explain why I was confident in my authorization to access those documents and why I refused to be intimidated by officers who assumed I didn't belong in that conference room. I've been handling classified information at the highest levels since I was 22 years old. The revelation hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, reshaping everyone's understanding of the entire situation. Elena could see the investigators realizing that they had been treating a decorated special operations veteran like a potential security risk, that their assumptions about her background and qualifications had been completely wrong. Chief Torres closed his suspension paperwork without signing it. "Ma'am, I think we need to contact Colonel Reyes immediately and verify this information before we proceed with any security actions." Elena realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to be destroyed, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she might have a chance to salvage her career and her reputation. The question was whether revealing her past would solve her current problems or create entirely new ones. "Lieutenant." Colonel Hayes reached for the secure phone mounted on the interview room wall with hands that Elena noticed were not entirely steady. The colonel's entire demeanor had shifted from professional skepticism to something approaching apprehension. Elena realized that Hayes understood the implications of what she had just revealed better than the other investigators, who were still processing the possibility that they had been interrogating a decorated special operations veteran. "Colonel Reyes, this is Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, Internal Security, Pentagon. I need immediate verification of classified personnel records for a security matter involving potential compromise of sensitive materials." Hayes paused, listening to the response. "Yes, ma'am, I understand the protocols." The individual in question claims service with Operational Detachment Alpha 18, Afghanistan deployment 2008 to 2010. Elena watched Hayes provide her personal information over the secure line, including details that only someone with legitimate military service would know. Social security number, date of birth, and service identification numbers that Elena had memorized but hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. The other investigators waited in tense silence, clearly aware that the next few minutes would either validate Elena's claims or expose them as an elaborate deception. "Yes, ma'am, she's present in the interview room now. Would you like to speak with her directly?" Hayes extended the phone toward Elena. "Colonel Reyes would like to verify your identity personally." Elena took the phone with steady hands. "Colonel Reyes, this is Elena Vasquez, former Staff Sergeant, ODA 18, serial number 123456789. Deployed Bagram Air Base, October 2008 through March 2010. The voice that came through the secure line was crisp, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to dealing with the most sensitive military personnel matters. "Sergeant Vasquez, I need you to provide verification details that would only be known to someone with legitimate ODA 18 service. Can you tell me the operational designation for the mission commemorated by the date on your unit tattoo?" Elena closed her eyes briefly, remembering details she had spent years trying to forget. "Operation Nightfall Harvest, ma'am. Counter-terrorism operation targeting high-value individuals coordinating insurgent activities in the Kunar province. Mission duration 14 days, successful completion with 0 friendly casualties, and elimination of primary objectives." Colonel Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Sergeant Vasquez, according to my records, you received several commendations for that operation, including a Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire. Is that correct?" Elena felt the familiar weight of memories she had spent years trying to suppress. "Yes, ma'am. Along with unit citations and operational commendations that remain classified." "Sergeant, please return the phone to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes." Elena handed the secure phone back to Hayes, who listened intently to whatever Colonel Reyes was telling her. Elena could see the lieutenant colonel's expression changing as she received information that was clearly far more significant than anyone in the room had anticipated. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. Thank you for the clarification." Hayes hung up the phone and turned to face Elena with an expression that mixed professional respect with obvious discomfort. "Miss Vasquez, Colonel Reyes has confirmed your military service and has authorized me to access your restricted personnel files for the security review." Captain Mitchell leaned forward with obvious curiosity. "Ma'am, what did Colonel Reyes tell you about Miss Vasquez's service record?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes consulted notes she had taken during the phone conversation. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez served with distinction in one of the military's most elite special operations units. Her service included multiple combat deployments, specialized training in intelligence analysis and classified material handling, and operational experience with the highest levels of sensitive information." Chief Torres was staring at Elena with completely different eyes. "Ma'am, Colonel Reyes also mentioned something about current security status. What did she mean by that?" Hayes hesitated before responding. "Chief, according to Colonel Reyes, Staff Sergeant Vasquez maintains what's called Lifetime Operational Security Clearance, a designation reserved for special operations personnel who have handled information so sensitive that their security status never expires, even after discharge from active duty." Elena realized that the investigators were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Far from being a potential security risk, she was someone whose background and clearance levels exceeded those of most people in the Pentagon, including some of the officers who had questioned her authority to access classified materials. The interview room door opened abruptly, and Colonel Morrison entered with Major Kim and the Navy captain from the morning's confrontation. All three looked like men who had just received very unwelcome news. Colonel Morrison's face was flushed, and he avoided making direct eye contact with Elena. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension, "I understand there have been some developments in this security review that require immediate clarification." Hayes stood to address the senior officers. "Colonel Morrison, we've verified that Miss Vasquez is a decorated Special Operations veteran with current security clearances that exceed the requirements for accessing the material she was working with this morning." Major Kim stepped forward, his expression mixing embarrassment with confusion. "Ma'am, how is that possible? Her personnel file shows no military service, and she's been working in administrative positions for years." Elena spoke for the first time since revealing her tattoo. "Major, my service was conducted under classified programs that don't appear in standard personnel databases. After my discharge, I was advised to maintain operational security by not disclosing my military background unless absolutely necessary." The Navy captain was studying Elena with obvious discomfort. "Miss Vasquez, if you had special operations background, why didn't you identify yourself when we questioned your presence in the conference room?" Elena felt a cold smile cross her face. "Captain, because my military service is irrelevant to my current job performance. I was in that conference room because I was assigned to be there, not because of what I did 10 years ago. I shouldn't have needed to prove my combat credentials to complete an administrative assignment." Colonel Morrison was clearly struggling with the realization that he had challenged and attempted to remove someone whose security clearance and military background far exceeded his own. "Miss Vasquez, I owe you an apology. We made assumptions based on incomplete information." Elena stood slowly, her posture subtly shifting to something that the military officers recognized as the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. "Colonel, you made assumptions based on my appearance and my current job title. You decided that a civilian clerk couldn't possibly belong in the same room as senior military officers, regardless of my actual qualifications or authorization." Chief Torres was reviewing the morning's events with obvious chagrin. "Ma'am, given your background, your behavior during the initial encounter makes much more sense. You were responding as someone accustomed to standing your ground under pressure. Elena nodded. Chief, I was responding as someone who knew I had done nothing wrong and refused to be bullied into abandoning my legitimate work assignment. My military training taught me to complete my mission, regardless of obstacles or opposition. Lieutenant. Colonel Hayes was now reviewing the suspension paperwork that remained unsigned on the table. Miss Vasquez, obviously we won't be proceeding with any security actions. In fact, given your background and clearance level, you're authorized to access materials well above the classification of the documents you were processing this morning. Elena realized that word of her true identity would spread through the Pentagon as quickly as the earlier rumors about her being a security risk. But this time, the story would be about senior officers who had attempted to remove a decorated special operations veteran from an assignment. She was overqualified to handle. Major Kim was clearly trying to process the complete reversal of the morning's events. Miss Vasquez, I don't understand why someone with your background would choose to work in an administrative position. Elena looked at him with the kind of direct gaze she had learned in combat zones. Major, I chose to work in a position where I could serve my country without having to kill people. After spending 2 years in combat, I wanted a job where success was measured by completing paperwork rather than eliminating targets. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Elena's statement. They were no longer dealing with a civilian clerk who had gotten above her station, but with a combat veteran who had deliberately chosen a quiet life and was now being forced to relive experiences she had spent years trying to leave behind. Colonel Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Vasquez, is there anything we can do to make this right? Elena gathered her personal items and prepared to leave the interview room that had nearly destroyed her career. Colonel, you can let me finish the work assignment I was given this morning. And maybe next time, you can ask questions before making assumptions about who belongs where. The walk back to Conference Room C felt like a victory parade in reverse. Word of Elena's true identity had spread through the Pentagon's informal communication network with the same efficiency that had earlier branded her a security risk. But now the whispered conversations carried a completely different tone. Elena could hear fragments of amazed discussions as she passed groups of personnel in the corridors. Did you hear about the clerk who turned out to be Special Forces? A young lieutenant was saying to his companion near the elevator bank. Apparently, she has higher clearance than half the officers in the building. I heard Colonel Morrison tried to have her removed from a briefing room, and she's got a Bronze Star for combat valor. Another voice added. Can you imagine the paperwork nightmare this is going to create? Elena maintained her professional composure as she walked between Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and Captain Mitchell, both of whom seemed uncertain about how to treat someone whose status had shifted so dramatically in the span of an hour. Behind them, Colonel Morrison, Major Kim, and the Navy captain followed in what could only be described as a subdued procession of senior officers who were beginning to understand the career implications of their morning's actions. When they reached Conference Room C, Elena found that her laptop and work materials had been carefully preserved exactly as she had left them. The boxes of classified documents were still arranged in the neat organizational system she had created, and her digitization progress remained intact on her computer screen. It was a small mercy that her work hadn't been completely destroyed. During the security investigation, Miss Vasquez, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said formally, your work area has been secured and your materials remain exactly as you left them. You're authorized to resume your assignment immediately. Elena surveyed the conference room that had been the center of so much conflict just hours earlier. Thank you, Colonel. I estimate I'll need approximately 6 more hours to complete the digitization process, assuming no further interruptions. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his face showing the strain of someone who was trying to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. Miss Vasquez, I want to personally apologize for this morning's events. We acted on incomplete information and made assumptions that were clearly inappropriate. Elena turned to face him directly, her expression neutral but her eyes carrying the kind of intensity that made Morrison visibly uncomfortable. "Colonel, your apology is noted, but I'm more concerned about ensuring this doesn't happen to other personnel who might not have the background to defend themselves effectively." Major Kim was standing near the window, clearly struggling with the realization that he had questioned the security clearance of someone whose military credentials far exceeded his own. "Ma'am, I need to ask, why didn't you correct our assumptions earlier? You could have avoided this entire situation by simply identifying yourself." Elena felt a familiar anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice level and professional. "Major, I shouldn't have needed to prove my combat credentials to complete an administrative assignment. The fact that you think my military service is relevant to the situation is exactly the problem." Captain Mitchell was reviewing the incident report that would need to be filed regarding the morning's events. "Miss Vasquez, from an investigative standpoint, this situation raises serious questions about our procedures for verifying personnel, authorization, and handling disputes over access rights." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, it also raises questions about the automatic assumptions that get made when senior personnel encounter someone they don't expect to see in a particular environment. This morning's events weren't really about security protocols. They were about who gets treated with respect and who gets treated as suspicious." The Navy captain, who had been silent since learning of Elena's background, finally spoke up. "Miss Vasquez, I owe you a particular apology. I questioned your need to know authorization for operational documents, when in fact your background with classified materials exceeds that of most personnel in this building." Elena studied him carefully. "Captain, what concerns me is that you were willing to question my authorization without any evidence of wrongdoing. You made assumptions based on my job title and appearance, then used those assumptions to justify treating me as a potential security threat." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was clearly trying to manage the broader implications of the incident. "Miss Vasquez, obviously we'll need to conduct a thorough review of this morning's events to identify procedural failures and prevent similar situations in the future." Elena turned back to her laptop and began resuming her digitization work. "Colonel, I hope your review includes an examination of how civilian employees are treated when they encounter military personnel who assume they don't belong in secure environments. This morning's events didn't happen because of procedural failures. They happened because of institutional bias." Colonel Morrison was clearly uncomfortable with Elena's continued criticism, but he seemed to recognize that he was in no position to challenge her assessment. "Miss Vasquez, what would you recommend to prevent similar incidents?" Elena paused in her work and looked directly at Morrison. "Colonel, I'd recommend that senior officers learn to ask questions before making demands. You could have resolved this entire situation with one phone call to verify my assignment, but instead you chose to treat me as an intruder who needed to be removed." Major Kim was reviewing his phone messages, clearly dealing with the administrative aftermath of the incident. "Ma'am, I'm getting inquiries from General Harrison's office about this situation. Apparently word has reached the senior staff level, and there are questions about how this was handled." Elena felt a grim satisfaction at the news. "Major, I hope General Harrison's review includes an assessment of whether his staff properly understand the difference between legitimate security concerns and personal convenience. This morning's conflict started because you wanted the conference room for an unscheduled meeting, not because I was violating any protocols." The Navy captain was now clearly anxious about the potential career implications of the incident. "Miss Vasquez, is there anything we can do to minimize the impact of this situation? I mean from a career standpoint for all of us involved." Elena looked up from her computer screen with an expression that was both amused and cold. "Captain, you're asking me to help protect the careers of people who spent the morning trying to destroy mine. That's an interesting approach to damage control." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped in before the conversation could escalate further. Miss Vasquez, I think what the captain is asking is whether you intend to file formal complaints about your treatment this morning. Elena considered the question carefully. Colonel, I'm more interested in completing my work assignment than in pursuing formal complaints. But I do think this incident should be documented thoroughly so that other personnel don't face similar treatment in the future. Captain Mitchell was taking notes for her incident report. Ma'am, for the record, would you characterize your treatment this morning as discriminatory or harassment? Elena saved her work and turned to face the assembled officers. Captain, I'd characterize it as what happens when people in positions of authority make assumptions about who belongs where based on superficial characteristics rather than actual qualifications. Whether you call that discrimination or just poor judgment is up to you. Colonel Morrison was clearly trying to find a way to conclude the conversation that might limit the damage to his reputation. Miss Vasquez, I want to assure you that this type of incident won't happen again, at least not on my watch. Elena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Colonel, I appreciate the sentiment, but this morning's events weren't an aberration. They were a predictable result of institutional attitudes that assume military rank equals moral authority and civilian employees are inherently less trustworthy or competent. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Elena's assessment. She had not only defended herself successfully, but had used the incident to highlight broader problems with how the Pentagon's culture treated personnel who didn't fit expected stereotypes. Elena returned to her digitization work, effectively dismissing the group of officers who were still trying to process the complete reversal of the morning's power dynamics. For the first time in hours, she felt like she was in control of her own situation, though she knew the consequences of revealing her identity would follow her for the rest of her career. The afternoon progressed with Elena working steadily through the remaining boxes of classified documents, but the atmosphere in Conference Room C had transformed completely. Rather than being an unwelcome intruder who needed to be monitored, she was now treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. Officers who passed by the conference room found excuses to glance inside, clearly curious about the civilian. Clerk, who had turned out to be a decorated special operations veteran. Around 3 o'clock, Elena became aware of a commotion in the corridor outside. Through the conference room's glass walls, she could see a small crowd gathering, with personnel pointing in her direction and engaging in animated discussions. The whispered conversations had evolved into something more significant. Elena realized that her story was becoming Pentagon legend in real time. General Patricia Harrison herself appeared in the doorway, accompanied by her aide and wearing an expression of professional curiosity mixed with obvious concern about the administrative disaster that had unfolded under her command. At 62, General Harrison was a 3-star officer with a reputation for no-nonsense leadership and zero tolerance for the kind of institutional failures that had characterized the morning's events. Miss Vasquez, General Harrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also a warmth that suggested genuine respect. I apologize for interrupting your work, but I felt it was important to speak with you personally about this morning's incident. Elena stood and faced the general with the bearing she had learned during her own military service. General Harrison, thank you for taking the time to address this situation directly. I appreciate your personal attention to what could have been handled at a much lower level. General Harrison entered the conference room, her aide remaining respectfully in the doorway. Miss Vasquez, I've received briefings about the circumstances that led to your security review, and I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received from my personnel. The actions taken this morning were inappropriate and contrary to our values. Elena appreciated the directness of the apology, but she also recognized an opportunity to address broader issues. General, I accept your apology, but I hope this incident will be used to examine how civilian employees are treated when they encounter situations like this. I had the background to defend myself, but other personnel might not be so fortunate. The general nodded thoughtfully. Miss Vasquez, that's exactly why I'm here. I've ordered a comprehensive review of our procedures for handling access disputes and personnel authorization questions. What happened to you this morning suggests we have systemic problems that go beyond individual mistakes. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction that her ordeal might result in meaningful changes. General, the core issue wasn't procedural, it was attitudinal. Your officers made assumptions about my qualifications and authority based on my appearance and job title, then used those assumptions to justify increasingly aggressive actions. General Harrison was taking notes on a secure tablet. Miss Vasquez, I'd like your input on specific policy changes that might prevent similar incidents. Your perspective as someone who experienced this treatment firsthand would be invaluable. Elena realized that the general was offering her something unprecedented, a direct role in shaping Pentagon policy regarding personnel treatment and access rights. General, I'd be honored to contribute to that effort. But I think the most important change would be cultural rather than procedural. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Morrison and Major Kim, both looking like men who had spent the afternoon receiving very unpleasant feedback from their superiors. General Harrison's expression hardened slightly as she turned to address them. Colonel Morrison, Major Kim, I've been reviewing your actions this morning, and I have significant concerns about your judgment and leadership. The general's voice carried the kind of cold authority that ended careers. Would either of you like to explain how a routine scheduling conflict escalated into a security investigation of a decorated veteran? Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his face pale with stress. General, we acted on what appeared to be legitimate security concerns. When we discovered Miss Vasquez working unsupervised with highly classified materials, and she refused to comply with our instructions to relocate, we followed what we believed were appropriate protocols. General Harrison's expression suggested she found this explanation inadequate. Colonel, at what point did you verify Miss Vasquez's authorization before demanding that she abandon her assignment? At what point did you contact her supervisor to confirm the legitimacy of her work orders? Major Kim attempted to defend their actions. Ma'am, the timeline was compressed, and we had immediate concerns about the security of sensitive materials. We felt it was appropriate to secure the situation first and verify details afterward. Elena watched this exchange with fascination. The officers who had spent the morning questioning her authority were now being dressed down by a general who clearly understood that they had failed to follow the most basic principles of fair treatment and due process. General Harrison turned back to Elena. Miss Vasquez, I understand you've been working in administrative positions for 6 years since your military discharge. Have you ever considered returning to more challenging assignments that would better utilize your background and experience? Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized the general might be offering her career opportunities that would never have been available to a civilian clerk. General, I chose administrative work because I wanted to serve my country in a capacity that didn't involve combat operations. But I'd certainly be interested in assignments that would allow me to contribute more significantly to the mission. The general consulted her tablet. Miss Vasquez, we have several positions in strategic planning and intelligence analysis that require your level of security clearance and operational experience. Would you be interested in discussing a lateral transfer to more senior responsibilities? Elena realized that revealing her identity had opened doors that had been closed to her for years. General, I'd be very interested in exploring those opportunities. I've sometimes felt that my current position doesn't fully utilize my capabilities. Colonel Morrison was clearly struggling with the realization that Elena might soon outrank him in the Pentagon hierarchy. General, if Miss Vasquez is transferred to strategic planning, She'd be working with materials classified well above the documents that caused this morning's concerns. General Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "Colonel, Miss Vasquez's security. Clearance authorizes her to access materials classified at levels that most personnel in this building will never see. The documents she was processing this morning were well within her authorization parameters, as you would have discovered if you had bothered to verify her credentials before challenging her presence." Elena felt a profound satisfaction watching the power dynamics that had oppressed her all morning being completely reversed. But she also recognized that her victory came with responsibilities. "General, if I do transfer to a more senior position, I'd like to work on developing training programs that help personnel understand appropriate responses to access disputes and authorization questions," Elena said. This morning's incident could have been completely avoided with better communication and verification procedures. General Harrison nodded approvingly. "Miss Vasquez, that's exactly the kind of systemic thinking we need. I'm prepared to offer you a position as Senior Intelligence Analyst with a focus on operational security and personnel protocols. It would be a significant upgrade in both responsibility and compensation." Elena felt the last pieces of her carefully constructed civilian identity falling away. "General, I accept your offer. But I hope this new position will allow me to ensure that other personnel don't face the kind of treatment I experienced this morning." The general stood to leave, but paused at the conference room door. "Miss Vasquez, one final question. Your work assignment this morning, did you complete the digitization project you were given?" Elena gestured to her laptop screen, which showed the final documents being processed. "General, I finished the last files about 10 minutes ago." Despite this morning's interruptions, the Syrian Operations Archive is now fully digitized and ready for tomorrow's review board meeting. General Harrison's expression showed genuine admiration. "Miss Vasquez, you completed your mission despite facing obstacles that would have defeated most people. That's exactly the kind of dedication and professionalism we need in senior positions." As the general departed with her entourage of chastened officers, Elena realized that her quiet life as an anonymous civilian clerk was officially over. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally in a position where her capabilities would be recognized and utilized. Appropriately, Elena packed up her laptop and prepared to leave Conference Room C for the last time as a GS7 administrative specialist. Tomorrow she would return to the Pentagon as a senior intelligence analyst with the authority and respect that her background and experience deserved. But more importantly, she would be in a position to ensure that no other employee would face the kind of institutional bias and systematic dismissal that had nearly destroyed her career. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez walked through the Pentagon corridors with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her bearing carried the authority of her new position as Senior Intelligence Analyst. But more importantly, it reflected the confidence that came from no longer hiding who she was or what she had accomplished. Her new office was located in the Strategic Planning Wing, 3 floors above her former cubicle in the administrative farm. The walls were lined with certificates acknowledging her military service, including the Bronze Star with V device that had remained hidden in a box for over a decade. A photograph on her desk showed her with the members of ODA, 18 young faces. That carried the intensity of people who had faced death together and survived. Elena was reviewing intelligence assessments for the morning briefing when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, there's a young woman here to see you. She says she's a new employee who was told to ask for you specifically." Elena looked up to see a nervous-looking woman in her mid-20s standing in the doorway. She wore a simple business suit and carried herself with the uncertain posture of someone who was still learning to navigate the Pentagon's complex social hierarchies. Her visitor badge identified her as Sarah Chun, GS5 administrative clerk. "Miss Chun, please come in, Elena." Sod, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. "How can I help you?" Sarah entered hesitantly, clearly intimidated by Elena's office and uncertain about why she had been directed to seek out a senior intelligence analyst. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Rodriguez in Human Resources said I should talk to you if I ever had problems with being treated unfairly because of my position." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "Ms. Chen, what kind of problems are you experiencing?" Sarah sat down carefully, still clutching her visitor. "Materials. Ma'am, I was assigned to support a briefing for senior staff yesterday, but when I arrived at the conference room, the officers there assumed I was lost. When I explained that I was there to set up the presentation materials, they told me that the briefing was for authorized personnel only and asked me to leave." Elena leaned back in her chair, recognizing the pattern that had become all too familiar over the past 6 months. Since word of her own experience had spread throughout the Pentagon, she had been contacted by dozens of civilian employees who faced similar treatment. "Ms. Chen, did you show them your work authorization and explain your assignment?" Sarah nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am. But they said that civilian personnel weren't supposed to handle sensitive briefing materials without direct supervision. They made me wait in the hallway while they called my supervisor to verify that I was really supposed to be there." Elena felt the familiar anger building, but she had learned to channel it into constructive action. "Ms. Chun, that treatment was inappropriate and contrary to established protocols. Did your supervisor confirm your authorization?" Sarah's voice grew smaller. "Yes, ma'am, but by the time they verified my assignment, I had missed the setup window and the briefing had to be delayed. The officers were angry about the delay, and they blamed me for creating confusion about my authorization." Elena stood up and walked to her window, which overlooked the Pentagon's central courtyard. She could see groups of personnel moving between meetings, briefings, and the countless other activities that kept the nation's defense apparatus functioning. But now she saw those interactions differently, aware of the subtle power dynamics and assumptions that shaped every encounter. "Ms. Chun, what you experienced was discrimination based on your position and appearance. The officers involved should have verified your authorization immediately rather than questioning your right to be there." Elena turned back to face her visitor. "I'm going to help you file a formal complaint, and I'm going to ensure that those officers receive additional training on appropriate treatment of civilian personnel." Sarah looked surprised. "Ma'am, I don't want to create problems for anyone. I just want to do my job without being treated like I don't belong here." Elena returned to her desk and pulled out a folder that had grown thick over the past 6 months. "Ms. Chun, creating problems for people who discriminate against civilian employees is exactly what we need to do. If we don't challenge inappropriate behavior, it will continue to happen to other people." The folder contained documentation of over 30 similar incidents that had been reported since Elena's own experience became widely known. Each case involved civilian employees being challenged, questioned, or dismissed by military personnel who assumed that rank trumped legitimate work authorization. Elena had made it her mission to ensure that every incident was properly investigated and that appropriate corrective actions were taken. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from General Harrison's office. The monthly Pentagon personnel policy review meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and Elena had been invited to present her findings on discrimination against civilian employees. What had started as her personal ordeal had evolved into a comprehensive effort to reform institutional attitudes throughout the Defense Department. "Ms. Chun, I want you to understand something important," Elena said, looking directly at the young woman who reminded her of herself 6 months earlier. "Your work has value, your presence here is legitimate, and you deserve to be treated with the same respect as any other authorized personnel. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Sarah's posture straightened slightly. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that you had your own problems with being treated unfairly. How did you handle it? Elena smiled, remembering the frightened woman who had sat in an interrogation room, convinced that her career was over. Miss Chun, I stood my ground when people tried to push me around, and I refused to let them make me feel like I didn't belong where I had every right to be. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Elena's door. Colonel Morrison entered, carrying a folder and wearing an expression that still carried traces of the embarrassment he felt whenever he encountered Elena. Over the past 6 months, their relationship had evolved into one of mutual professional respect, though Elena knew that Morrison would never completely recover from the humiliation of his initial treatment of her. Ms. Vasquez, I apologize for interrupting, but I have the preliminary results from the command climate survey you requested, Morrison said, placing the folder on Elena's desk. The findings are enlightening. Elena opened the folder and reviewed the statistical analysis that Morrison's staff had compiled. The survey had been distributed to all civilian employees in the Pentagon, asking about their experiences with discrimination, inappropriate treatment, and barriers to effective job performance. The results painted a picture of systematic bias that was far more extensive than even Elena had suspected. Colonel Morrison, these numbers are striking, Elena said, reviewing the data. 47% of civilian employees report being questioned about their authorization for routine work assignments. 32% report being treated differently based on their appearance or position. And 61% report avoiding certain areas of the building because they expect to be challenged by military personnel. Morrison nodded grimly. Ms. Vasquez, the survey also revealed that most civilian employees don't report these incidents because they assume nothing will be done about them. Your case has encouraged people to come forward with problems they've been dealing with for years. Elena realized that her decision to stand her ground 6 months earlier had unleashed a flood of similar stories from people who had been suffering in silence. Colonel, what recommendations are you prepared to make based on these findings? Morrison consulted his notes. We're proposing mandatory training for all military personnel on appropriate treatment of civilian employees, revised protocols for verifying work authorization, and establishment of a formal complaint process that protects employees from retaliation. Elena felt a deep satisfaction that her ordeal was resulting in systemic changes that would benefit thousands of civilian employees. Colonel, I'd also recommend regular command climate assessments to ensure that these changes are actually implemented, rather than just existing on paper. Sarah Chun had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. Ma'am, you're changing policies for the entire Pentagon because of what happened to you. Elena turned to address her directly. Miss Chun, I'm changing policies because what happened to me happens to other people every day. The only difference is that I had the background and resources to fight back effectively. Most civilian employees don't have that luxury. Elena's assistant appeared in the doorway again. Ma'am, General Harrison's office called. The Personnel Policy Review meeting has been moved up to 2 o'clock, and the General specifically requested that you bring examples of individual cases to illustrate the systemic issues you've identified. Elena gathered Sarah Chun's complaint forms and added them to the growing file of documented incidents. Miss Chun, would you be willing to have your case included in my presentation to General Harrison? Your experience perfectly illustrates the problems we're trying to solve. Sarah nodded with growing confidence. Yes, ma'am. If it helps other people avoid what I went through, I'm willing to share my story. Elena stood up and prepared to leave for the meeting that would determine whether her recommendations became Pentagon policy. 6 months earlier, she had been an anonymous clerk fighting for her right to complete a simple work assignment. Now she was positioned to implement changes that would affect the treatment of civilian employees throughout the Defense Department, but more importantly, She had learned that standing up to injustice, even when the odds seemed impossible, could create ripple effects that extended far beyond personal vindication. Her refusal to accept inappropriate treatment had inspired others to speak up, had exposed systematic problems, and had created opportunities for meaningful reform. As Elena walked toward General Harrison's office, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from hiding her identity to embracing it, from accepting discrimination to fighting it, and from protecting herself to protecting others. Her small tattoo had indeed changed everything, but not in ways she could ever have anticipated. The lesson she had learned, and was now teaching others, was simple but powerful. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or appearance. And sometimes, defending that principle requires the courage to stand your ground, even when everyone else thinks you should back down. Elena's story had become Pentagon legend, but its real value lay in the lasting changes it had inspired, and the message it sent to anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong where they had every right to be. 2 years later, Elena stood at the podium of the Pentagon's main auditorium, addressing a packed audience of military and civilian personnel. The annual Elena Vasquez Award for Courage in the Workplace was being presented to its first recipient, a young Navy petty officer who had stood up to harassment from senior personnel. This award exists because one person refused to accept that their position determined their worth, Elena announced to thunderous applause. It reminds us that respect isn't earned by rank alone, but by how we treat those who seem to have less power than ourselves. In the audience, Sarah Chun, now a GS-12 intelligence specialist, smiled as she remembered the nervous woman who had once been afraid to enter a conference room. Mrs. Hendricks, who had quietly supported Elena throughout her ordeal, dabbed at her eyes with pride. General Harrison approached the podium. The Vasquez Protocol has been adopted by all service branches. Because of one woman's courage, thousands of service members and civilians now work in environments built on mutual respect rather than intimidation. Elena's tattoo, no longer hidden, caught the auditorium lights as she raised her hand in acknowledgement. What did you think of Elena's incredible journey? Have you ever stood up to unfair treatment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads.